Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, and I do want to get back into some of the international headlines right now as Russian President Vladimir Putin warning the U.S. against any deeper involvement in Moscow's war with Ukraine, saying there's the risk of a global nuclear conflict. Alex Hogan with Fox News joining us now live with more on that blunt warning from Putin. Good morning, Alex. A lot to this.
A lot to break down. Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me. So some very strong words that we heard from Russian President Vladimir Putin warning the West not to interfere, and that if there is further interference, he says there could be a nuclear conflict. He had made all of these comments at this speech today. This was a speech that he gave to Parliament, this annual address. And as I mentioned, very strong words saying that the West is trying to interfere and arguing that the vast majority of Russians fully support the war in Ukraine. Now, while there's no specific way to verify those numbers, that was his stance today as we look at what has now been 2 years since the start of the war, the full-on invasion in February of 2022. Now, what is going to take place in the weeks to follow? Presidential elections are set to take place mid-March, so about 2 weeks from now. Russian President Vladimir Putin is warning that he will not let anyone interfere with those elections. And we are going to see some changes this time around in what will take place in presidential elections there. So while the exact voting will not be until about the 15th of March. Some of the early voting process has already began. For the first time, there will be online voting, and there's also going to be voting taking place in some of the occupied territories in Ukraine. The West has fully condemned that, as well as the government of Kyiv. However, we know that those polling places will still play out. All of this taking place as we very well expect to see Russian President Vladimir Putin have a fifth term as president. He is expected to win, despite the fact that there are several other opponents, but they are all in Kremlin-approved parties. His main political opponents have largely either been exiled abroad or they are behind bars in Russian jails. Most notably, one of the most famous Russian opposition leaders was Alexei Navalny, the 47-year-old who died in jail about almost 2 weeks ago now. So he, despite that fact, before his death, had made a lot of claims and a lot of encouragement to his supporters, urging them this year to go to the polls in numbers, to create long lines, and to voice their opposition to Putin as well. Josh.
And Alex, I know that initially there were reports that Navalny's body had been held, of course, by the Kremlin. It was eventually released, and my understanding is that there will be a funeral tomorrow.
That's correct. So the funeral is set to take place tomorrow. It will be at a church before his body is buried. There is an expectation that there could be a wide show of support for him. That being said, we have seen hundreds of people who have gone to memorials and rallies in his name be arrested. So there is definitely going to be a sense of skepticism and fear of what could follow depending on the numbers that we potentially could see. We have also heard from Navalny's wife, who spoke yesterday to the European Parliament, encouraging people to continue to voice their opposition and condemning Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying that there is no negotiating with this man. We've also heard from critics in Russia voicing their stance that this is not simply a death, that this was a murder. So I think we're going to see many of his supporters out there tomorrow. It's worth noting the memorials that have popped up all around the world. Here in London, outside the Russian embassy, the street, the corners completely filled with flowers and posters memorializing him, celebrating his bravery, and taking a moment to really look at a man who spent so much of his life speaking out against corruption, trying to create a new change within Russia. And Yulia Navalnaya, his wife, spoke out yesterday saying it is so unfortunate that he, despite all of his attempts to create change in Russia, will never be alive to see it. Josh.
All right, Alex Hogan there with Fox News. Thank you so much for helping to break down that speech, of course, by Putin, but also the latest here on Navalny. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh.